Welcome back, grade 10s. Today we're looking at lesson 20, responses to global challenges. And the main topic underneath that umbrella we're looking at is anti-globalism. A topic that we, to some extent, got started yesterday. One of the things I asked you to think about on your way out yesterday was, what might be some reasons that people might be feeling anti-global? So let's begin with a review of that. What might be some reasons behind anti-globalism? Yes, sir.
You don't like people.
So maybe people are anti-global because they're anti-social. They just don't like others. And if globalization is the interconnectedness of mankind, one of the reasons behind anti-globalism is anti-socialism. They just don't want to connect with others. Yes?
Preserving culture and tradition.
So a big one that we see with groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and people that shaped the 21st century so far, like Osama bin Laden. Why was Osama bin Laden so angry with the United States that he and Al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. on September the 11th? Well, they attacked the United States because they felt that the United States was a threat to them and their traditional life. That they thought globalization brought American cultural imperialism to them. And they felt that eventually they would be assimilated. And they didn't want to lose what they cherish. They didn't want to lose their religion and culture. So one of the main reasons that some feel anti-global is because they associate globalism with Americanism and Americanization, or they associate globalism with assimilation and homogenization, and they have something that they cherish, like a unique culture or religion. Yes?
Mental illness.
So, did you say mental illness? So maybe not at a national or macro group level, but there might be certain individuals that want to isolate because of other challenges that they're facing, other personal challenges they're facing. Are there any circumstances that might convince nations that they need to practice anti-globalism? Yes?
Pandemics.
So during pandemics, during crisis, we might want to isolate and insulate your nation from the crisis. You might want to try to protect your nation from the crisis. So currently we are in the middle of a pandemic, COVID-19, and during this time many countries around the world closed their borders. And closing their borders by definition is an anti-global measure, right? So definitely in times of crisis, countries may want to practice isolationism. Yes, sir?
Times of war.
Times of war. So during war, if you're not a combatant in the war, maybe you don't want to become a combatant. You don't want to be dragged into the war. You want to practice isolationism. So how do you practice isolationism during a time of war? Well, you might resist making connections with the combatants. One thing that you can do before war is even declared is you avoid creating or joining agreements. So if you're an anti-global country, then maybe you don't join an organization like NATO, an organization built on mutual security. So if you want to insulate yourself from military conflicts, not only will you maybe not join defensive pacts like NORAD or NATO, but during a war, you may want to close your border. You may also need to close your border because war tends to create millions of refugees. And if you're anti-global, you might fear what impact accepting millions of new citizens into your country might do. Any other reasons for anti-globalism? What about economic reasons? Let's go there. Any economic reasons why people might look at globalism and say, yeah, no, I don't like that because this is what happens economically. Yes?
Immigrants take up jobs.
So some people look at globalization and they see that the marketplace continues to evolve and change, and they might feel threatened by that. Maybe they feel threatened because they associate globalism with a world labor market, and within a world labor market, their labor might be worth less than it would be if we didn't have to compete with workers around the world. Yes?
Trading could make the native resources run out.
Yeah, so trading might make your resources run out. So if Canada trades with other countries, then our finite resources will become more scarce and they will expire more quickly. What are some terms that are often described with economic globalization? When we think of qualities or characteristics of mankind, yes? So collectivism. So those who see the common good, that need to work together, might embrace globalism. But those who don't see the common good, maybe they want to protect themselves from globalism. So there's something called the Great Green Wall. Maybe you've heard of it.
When you have a big ego.
No, I'm thinking of something else.
No, I'm thinking of when you have a big ego.
The Great Green Wall is this project in North Africa to create a strip of trees to stop the spread of the desert and to change the landscape in North Africa. So they're building a Great Green Wall. You can see where the plan is to build it, and it's to, instead of see the spread of desertification, it's to maybe desertify, right? It's to bring lush environment back. But this is a project that Ethiopia can't do on its own. Sudan can't do it on its own. Chad and Nigeria or Niger can't do it on its own. These North African countries need to work together. So this is a reason to globalize, but some people might not want to work with others. Maybe they don't like becoming more connected to their neighbors, because as Niger works with Chad, some of their differences, some of their cultural, traditional, historic differences, their different values may clash, and then it may actually create a conflict. So there's reasons to work together, but then some look at it and say the cost is too much. One of the main topics we've looked at is outsourcing and sweatshops. How might outsourcing and sweatshops give us evidence that we should deglobalize? Because globalization is associated with what? Yeah. With what characteristic of mankind? Yes? Disparity. Exploitation. So this course has been about the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Why might you not want to globalize? Well, maybe you're the weak. And if you globalize, you're going to suffer. So how do you defend yourself from the suffering? How do you insulate yourself from the suffering? You put up a wall. So another reason that some might want to resist globalization is that they feel that if they globalize, they will be the ones who will suffer. So there is a quick link at the beginning of this lesson about anti-globalization and counter-globalization movements. Most of these anti-globalization movements, in their foundation, what they really are is anti-capitalism movements. That they're associating capitalism with globalization, and when they look into capitalism, they see exploitation. They see the strong feeding on the weak. So many of these anti-global movements at heart are a rejection of the economic aspect of globalization, because they see economically the strong feeding on the weak. That's why we have things like the Occupy movement that we've mentioned with the 1% and the 99%. Now I want you to think back to the beginning of this long unit. This unit began in chapter 9. This unit began with the 20th century. I want you to think back to chapter 9 and say, what might be the targets of an anti-globalist? Who are they going to blame for the current economic global village? What are the pillars of this global village? Where did everything get started? Yes?
Christopher Columbus.
So that would be going back a long, long time, right?
You told us.
So you could definitely go back to Columbus.
He globalized and then he ended up killing thousands of people.
He definitely did. So if you look at globalization and you're anti-globalization because you associate it with genocide and cultural contamination, then you hate Columbus. And you're going to, on Columbus Day in the United States, you're going to protest and stuff like that.
Right.
but I'm thinking more contemporary. Yes? The rich. Okay, so we're going to focus on the 1%, the wealthy, the elite, the Jeff Bezos that have $184 billion. Just this week, Elon Musk went from number 1 back to number 2 because he lost $14 billion on the stock market. It's just a week for him. You know, he's okay. You don't have to write him a letter of sympathy. He'll get over it. But where was the foundation of contemporary economic globalization laid? Yes?
The shipping containers?
So we have shipping containers. So you might get mad at that guy, that trucker that made the shipping containers. So that might be the focus of your hatred. You might go down to the harbor and start protesting against the container. Containers don't really take that personally though, being that they're inanimate objects. They don't get upset when you protest against a container. But you could start attacking ships. You know, if you're a terrorist, an anti-global terrorist, maybe you're going to attack the lifeblood of globalization, these shipping containers. That's how you impact the global village. Still looking for the golden answer here though. So where was the foundation of contemporary economic globalization laid? So before it, people were practicing competition, and then nations said, you know what, let's work together. Yes?
The
Bretton Woods Conference. So when we go back to the Bretton Woods Conference, what are the institutions that remain that came out of Bretton Woods that somebody would say, you're bad, this institution's bad? What are the children of Bretton Woods? What are the institutions created there that anti-globalists, if there's a meeting of this organization, they'd be outside with their signs and saying, you people are bad. So there's 3 easy ones to think about. Yes?
The European Union?
The European Union is an organization. It didn't come out of Bretton Woods though. It definitely is an organization.
The World Bank?
World Bank, IMF, and the WTO that was originally GATT. So we got GATT, we got World Bank and IMF based upon the video of the corporation. Based upon the story coming from Bolivia, from Cochabamba. Why might somebody be angry with the IMF? What did the IMF do there that you would say, oh man, globalization is set up just for the rich. And it's set up so the rich can feed on the weak. And that's why somebody might have an anti-IMF sign, and they'll go outside the IMF headquarters and they'll protest because they associate the IMF with bad things because of this case study. What happened? Yes?
Didn't they say that the water had to be owned by something?
So the city of Cochabamba, the 3rd biggest city in Bolivia, they needed money to repair their infrastructure, their water infrastructure. They needed to repair their sewage. They didn't have enough money. So they decided to privatize. Privatize is take something that's publicly owned and sell it to private interests. So they privatized the water industry in Cochabamba, and a corporation, a transnational from San Francisco, California called Bechtel bought it. And when they bought it, Bechtel helps pay for the repair of the infrastructure of water in Cochabamba, but Bechtel also said, now we're going to increase the cost of water so that it costs 1/4 of the income of families in Cochabamba. Based on that, you can see how the IMF was consulted by Bolivia. Bolivia went to the IMF and said, we need some money. And the IMF said, you need to privatize. So why did Cochabamba privatize their water industry? Because that's the advice the IMF said. You want some assistance from us, you need to privatize. The World Bank says, you want a loan from us, you need to privatize. So when these children of Bretton Woods are consulted by developing countries, and developing countries are like, we need a loan. We need a loan so that we can repair our water. They're like, well, we can give you money, but you have to do something in return. You have to help us with our agenda. And our agenda is we want to see free trade all around the world. So we want you to privatize things that are in your country that are not privatized. So in Cochabamba, that meant privatizing water, but when they did that, it allowed the strong to prey upon the weak. So in summary, some people might be anti-IMF Because when they look at a case study like Cochabamba, Bolivia, they see that when the municipal government of Cochabamba, Bolivia went to the IMF and said, we need some emergency funds here, IMF said, you need to privatize. And when they followed the advice of the IMF and they privatized, that led to the weak people of Cochabamba being preyed upon the strong corporation of Bechtel. So why might people be anti-IMF? Because they associate the IMF with bad things. They associate it with exploitation. So we have anti-globalization. Often we'll have meetings in big cities like in Paris, Madrid, in Seattle, and when world leaders get together, the world press is paying attention to it, right? If you have a dozen or 24, or in some cases 100 world leaders all gathering in one city, then now the press is watching, the world is watching, and that's when we get thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of protesters outside these meetings saying things are bad, saying that these guys are exploiting the weak, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and that's why globalization is actually just a big setup so that the rich can get richer and we become more servient to them. So what is anti-globalization? It's this idea that the global village is being set up in a way so that the strong can continue to prey upon the weak. So in your notes, right now you should be able to look down and you should have some reasons why people feel anti-global. You should also have some kind of definition of what does it mean to be anti-global. The next logical step would be to start taking a look at some sources and see anti-globalization. So here we have someone petitioning against the WTO. And the person could have drawn anything, but they drew a symbol of death. So what they're associating the World Trade Organization with is death. That they're suggesting that if we invite the global interests into our country, then the result will be death to our people. In the textbook, they talk about Shell. The transnational corporation of Shell working in Nigeria. And Shell's involved in oil and natural gas in Nigeria, but also in Nigeria, there's some nomadic people, like the Bedouin people of the Middle East. These are nomads that they follow animals and they live a less modern, more traditional lifestyle. But sometimes these tribes of nomadic people passing through areas that are being developed for oil and natural gas interests can be disruptive. You know, if you're trying to create a new well and a few hundred people are passing through with their animals, that might shut down work for a few days. So in Nigeria, Shell didn't ask the government to do this, but in Nigeria, the government, recognizing that it was inconvenient for these nomadic people to be passing through areas that Shell was trying to develop, the government just executed them. That's an example of what this source is trying to represent. That when our governments no longer represent the interests of us, so in our case Canadians, when our government is less concerned about Canada and more concerned about the world, it puts us vulnerable to outside influences. And for countries in the third or developing world, that can often mean that they're vulnerable to exploitation, to sweatshops, to summary execution like in Nigeria, things like that. We've got this illustration. I've put this one on the final exam before. I can't guarantee you'll see it this year because, you know, we rotate questions, we have different anchor questions and stuff like that. Sometimes it's on the final A1, so you could see this on your A1 next week. So there is an ideological perspective here. So if you're breaking this source down, you might be able to say this is Seattle, that's the Space Needle. Maybe you don't recognize that as Seattle, but you definitely recognize it as a building in a modern city. And you have some protesters that are saying the WTO is pulling us this way but democracy is that way. The suggestion is that the WTO is leading countries away from democracy. Democracy is the will of the people. So in Canada, democracy is the will of the Canadian people. But they're suggesting the WTO, and you could put in the IMF, the World Bank, any of these global institutions, they're pulling governments away from their people. Again, you could look at Cochabamba, Bolivia, and you'd see evidence of that. That when the water prices quadrupled in Bolivia and people started protesting in the streets, the police came in, not to protect the protesters, but to protect Bechtel. The police started fining people for collecting rainwater because that was in violation of Bechtel's ownership of water in the city. So this source is suggesting that you have these global institutions, these global players like the WTO, like the IMF, like the World Bank. They're pulling countries away from democracy, and that's not what they want. Now, if you look closer, it says here that there's a symbol of like a panther, and you can make out maybe the word Rain Forest Action Network. What do you think is another concern of these people based upon that their symbol is a panther? And that their name of their NGO, their non-governmental organization that's lobbying, that's protesting, that's trying to get the world's attention is the Rainforest Action Network. Yes?
They're trying to stop globalization because it's causing the loss of habitats and other ecological important factors.
Yeah, so to get above an S on this A1, you'd have to say that. You'd have to identify what is their purpose. You know, what's their agenda? So we get it that they're anti-globalization. That's a perspective. But why are they anti-global? Be more specific. Specifically, looking at this detail within the source, we can infer, suggest, right? Because it doesn't say these guys hate this because of this, but based on that, we can infer it. So it's implicit, not explicit. We can infer that if they're called the Rainforest Action Network, that this is why they're upset with globalism. They're not upset because of sweatshops. You know, we don't see a kid working at a loom or something like that. Specifically, this is what they don't like about globalism, based upon the name of the group. This source should also inspire you to think about, you know, when is it acceptable to voice your discontent with government? And when you voice your discontent with government, should it be limited? Is there a time where your voice of discontent or dissent is too radical, too extreme, and therefore illegal? Should the voice of discontent be sometimes censored or even muted, completely silenced? So we have seen the voice of discontent in DC in the last 2 weeks, and we'll see the voice of discontent for weeks coming. And that's something I'd like you to think about. Yes, sir?
I think definitely not, because the majority of the population should be clever enough to realize what's good and what's bad for them, and the radicals or idiots will always sort of be left out. And if you take that away from them, they won't be able to realize what's helping them and what's not. So that's why when America was so super patriotic, they sort of forgot that there were people out there that didn't like their countries. So they sort of had some pretty stupid notions that they developed.
So democracy is ruled by the people, and it's meant to be all the people. And if you only allow one version of reality to be shared, then that one version of reality could become poisonous and toxic, and it may mislead your country into a dangerous future. When you look at this protest, this makes me think of John Stuart Mill. Cast of characters, you're meant to be creating a cast of characters, so when I'm talking about names, you're meant to be writing them down. So John Stuart Mill, and you're looking at this source, and I think of John Stuart Mill. So, who is John Stuart Mill? Anyone?
No clue.
No clue. So let's bring him up for you. So, he's another old dead white guy. that looks like the oldest, deadest, whitest guy ever. Like, let's be honest, he's an old dead white guy. He is the old dead white guy. So, unfortunately, he has those qualities. But we really talk about one of his main beliefs, and that's the harm principle. He's got lots of beliefs, but we typically talk about the harm principle. And it's the idea that you should be free as long as your freedom doesn't harm someone else. Makes sense. So I can go around this room kicking my feet, you know, as long as I don't go and kick someone, then what's the harm? I should be free to do that. But if I suddenly start kicking people, well then I'm hurting you, my freedom should be limited. So to John Stuart Mill, the only reasonable time to limit your freedom is when you're hurting someone else. So back to the picture of the protesters from Seattle, are they hurting anyone? Are they hurting anyone by showing their discontent? Did anybody get killed when they did this?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so.
But you never know.
You don't know. Maybe after they did this, they repelled down and they just started shooting people. Right? They put up the sign, and then they're like, enough of the sign, now it's time for action. But if this was the complete story of their protest, they put up a giant sign. Yes, they broke the law because they climbed up buildings to do it, and they don't have the right to do that. So they didn't break the law. But when they climbed the buildings, they didn't do any harm to the buildings. They didn't break a gargoyle or something that was on the side of a building. They put up the sign. Have they harmed others? Sir?
I'm just confused how that guy's like just floating in midair, just holding on to a flag.
This guy?
No, right corner.
This guy?
Both of those dudes actually.
So it's tethered at the top to buildings. It's kind of like a banner that's strung between two buildings. So there'd be a building over here and a building over there. It's kind of like Spider-Man. You know, he's always attached to something, right? Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies, watch out. Oh, there goes the Spider-Man. Well, these guys are like Spider-Man. They're attached to something over here. They're attached to buildings. So as long as they haven't harmed anyone, then protest should be legal. Looking into DC though, you know, there was a pipe bomb that exploded. There's people that had homemade napalm. They had assault rifles. They had the intention of taking hostages. Maybe it's at that point when your intention is to do harm that you need to be restricted. That's kind of leaning into the second lesson that we'll get to after the break about human rights. I want you to be able today to think about these are the rights we have, this is why they're important, but this is why they need to be limited at times. And just kind of marrying the two concepts together, here's anti-globalism. They have the right to protest. In the United States, you know, they have the right to petition the government. That is one of the First Amendments. In the U.S. Bill of Rights, you have the right to worship, you have the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and petition and assembly. Those are the fundamental rights in the U.S. and the Bill of Rights. These guys are petitioning, right? They're saying this is what's wrong. And as long as it's a peaceful protest, you could argue, what's the harm? What's the harm being done here? Others might say it is a sign of civil disobedience, and if others follow the Rainforest Action Network, maybe harm will be done because the United States pulls out of the WTO, jobs are lost, families go hungry, right? Like you could hypothetically create a chain of events where that because of what they do here, people get harmed. You could definitely think critically along those lines. Unfortunately, some of these battles, some of these anti-protest battles have been over things as basic as food. Even in this year that has just passed 2020, Seattle was the home of an autonomous region, right? Remember, there's a group of people that took control over the Capitol Hill, and they had this Chaz autonomous region, and at times the government changed as the people kept throwing out their leaders and getting new leaders. So that is also a symbol of people being unhappy with this current paradigm, which is globalization. Second half of this lesson just looks at, how can we describe globalization? And it looks at the economic components of it. It's described through different free trade agreements. And as this map shows, there's a lot of free trade agreements out there. Most of the world is engaged in some form of free trade. So to what extent has the world embraced globalism? Well, these are all different trading blocks that try to better connect people. Now, with globalization can come political and social change. Based upon this cartoon, what kind of political and social change has globalization brought? And based on that cartoon, has it been a positive social political change? So based upon the details within that cartoon, what has been the social political change that has been created because of globalization? So you look at the details and you have USSR, and Poland, and Romania, and Bulgaria, and Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, and you just have like little bits of boots left, right? And now you got China, North Korea, and Cuba, and you got guys standing there.
He's got a Cuban.
And then there were 3. So what has been taken away? Dictatorships, and specifically what type?
Communist.
So communist dictatorships around the world have fallen because of globalism. And these guys look a little nervous. So if you think communism's bad, then this is a celebration of globalism. Because it's celebrating that through globalism, we've been able to defeat these dictatorships. But if you think communism's good, then you might think globalism's bad, because you're losing something that you cherish. How might globalism help a people defeat a dictator? How might globalization help people in a society defeat a dictatorship? Yes?
They have other countries on their side trying to go against dictatorship.
Yeah, so if I'm the dictator, you don't have to fight me alone. You can have allies. And let's be honest, you're going to need allies to fight me because, I'm just a Superman like that. So it's going to give you allies. And with allies, they'll give you training. And they'll give you, yes?
With globalization, you can use things like phones and foreign newspapers to learn about the outside world and realize just how much of a crapshoot you're currently living in.
Yeah, so if you are living in an isolated society, maybe you don't know better. Maybe you just think that it's natural to eat trees. And it's natural for a quarter of your people to be living in prison. And it's natural that if your grandfather committed a crime, that you were born in jail because your family's condemned to 2 generations of guilt because of your granddad's crime. Maybe you just think that's the way it is. And that is the way it is in North Korea. But because globalization allows the outside world in, then you actually get the window into the Western world, and you can see, maybe life's better somewhere else. Yes?
So you just grow up with your family in jail in North Korea, like just your grandpa?
Some are condemned to be in jail, yes. Depending upon the crime. Absolutely. And it's about a quarter of the population in jail.
How are you supposed to have kids who are in jail?
People can still meet people in jail.
So they're like both gender jail.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I do understand, and I do appreciate that that's the part of your lesson that you really want to visualize. You're like, wait a minute, how are people hooking up in jail? I get the anti-globalization part, but I just need to understand the nuances of this.
And like say I'm the last generation that's in jail, what happens in my kid just goes out of jail and me and my wife are stuck in jail or what?
Might be.
Feel bad, dude.
So the suggestion here is that globalization can actually be a positive political, social, cultural force because it can create or it can invite necessary change into societies. If your argument was that, if your argument at the top of a paragraph was that globalization is a positive force, because it can invite necessary political, social, and cultural change. What's your evidence? What are your case studies? What's the most convincing case studies that show globalization is actually a positive force because it invites necessary, important, political, social, cultural change? So you can look at this cartoon for some inspiration. At the end of the cartoon, you have USSR. So one case study might be the end of communism in the USSR. So the USSR no longer exists. It fell because of globalization. The Cold War ended not because the United States defeated the Soviets on the battlefield, but the United States beat them in an ideological conflict. That the Americans won the hearts and minds of the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Latvians, Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Armenians, the Azerbaijanis, the Kazakh, like, we could just name them all if we wanted to, but I'm gonna claim ignorance and just end it there. So it was a war of ideology, and in that war, the United States won the hearts and minds of the people in the USSR by convincing them that they should adopt a Western lifestyle. That if they had a political economic system like America, their lives would be better, they'd be happier. So with globalization comes an opportunity for new ideas to come in, and it might be the necessary new ideas. Other than those countries listed up there, USSR, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, is there another area of the world that maybe after this cartoon was made, another area of the world that saw revolutions because of globalism? Because the people in those areas were connected to the outside world through media, through social media, through things like Facebook and Instagram. They're like, you know what? Our government is poisonous. We need a different type of government. So where else has globalization helped spread democracy? Anyone? Yes?
A monarchy.
Which monarchy?
All of them that are not existing.
Well, we still have one. We have a constitutional monarch in Canada. We have the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. She's a lovely lass, right? But you're right, there are some monarchies that have been challenged.
France changed to democracy after abolishing the monarchy after the American Revolution.
Okay, so we can go back historically and look at, the Americans inspired the French Revolution, and because of the French Revolution, the Bourbon dynasty is at least temporarily ended in France, and we'll get to study that revolution next year in 20. Definitely one of the best case studies in high school social studies. What about something more contemporary, something within the last 10 years? An area of the world that saw a flood of change because the people in that area are like, you know what, I think we're aware of a better life. We've seen definitely some protests and revolutions in Hong Kong with the umbrella protests and stuff like that. So Hong Kong's a place to keep an eye on for sure.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia still has the House of Saud ruling them, but there are some changes being made in Saudi Arabia. When you're born, women did not have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia because while you're driving, it would have a negative influence on their uterus. Because the uterus is right there by the steering wheel, it shouldn't be there. They need to be protected from that. So women couldn't drive, and you take away the right to drive, you really limit the freedom of women. It's not Saudi Arabia though.
I think India.
In India, India's been a democracy since 1948. So the biggest, healthiest, well not healthiest, but biggest democracy in the world.
I'm not sure, but China.
So China had a major protest in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. Tank Man said, we demand democracy, and then, China's still a one-party state today, and Tank Man disappeared from history. So China still needs that pro-democracy revolution to be finished. I'm thinking of some call it the Jasmine Revolution, some call it the Arab Spring. Happens in North Africa, begins in Tunisia with a jasmine merchant who lights himself on fire.
Never heard of it.
He lights himself on fire, He eventually dies, like he doesn't die right there, because people came to his aid and tried to put the fire out, but he will die as a result of it within a couple of weeks in a hospital. But people around Tunisia, they start saying, wow, this guy lit himself on fire. I want to know why. And why did he light himself on fire? Because the police tried to do a shakedown, right? They tried to force him to pay a bribe. They're like, I want to see your papers that allow you to be a street vendor, a merchant. And he's like, here are my papers. I have the right papers. And they're like, no, you're going to need to pay us a little bit extra. And you have a street vendor, a street merchant, that's selling jasmine on the streets, and he's on the edge of poverty already. He's barely making it, barely surviving, right? And he understands that if he needs to continually bribe the police to stay in business, he will never get ahead. So he feels so frustrated with his reality, and he understands that his government is so toxic, he doesn't want to live under that government anymore. So he pours gasoline over himself, lights himself on fire, as a symbol of the protest that his government has betrayed him. But then you have people living in like Egypt, and they're like, well, wait a minute, life's worse here than it was there. I thought life was good in Tunisia compared to us. So what happens is, his act of protest in Tunisia inspires people throughout North Africa and the Middle East. So we have a wave of revolutions. And the revolutions all come back to one merchant that says life should be better because I know it's better somewhere else, because globalization allows me to know it's better somewhere else. And then once he does his act of protest, people in other countries know about his protest and they're inspired by it. Globalization connects us with role models. And he becomes a hero, a role model, an inspiration for others. And we call it the Arab Spring. And because of the Arab Spring, governments that had been in power for decades are toppled. And democracy, at least to some extent, grows through North Africa and into the Middle East. So today's message is about anti-globalism, but some might say, no, globalism's actually a good thing because it's spreading ideas like freedom and democracy to areas of the world that need to hear the message. That these are people that are celebrating democracy, and democracy is something that they're learning through the global village. So we're about to have our mask break. When we get back, we're going to learn about human rights. It's a little chilly outside, but I'd recommend that you go anyway. Let's try to be back here at 1:35. I'm going to be talking at 1:35, so that's 14 minutes from now. If you don't want to go outside, you can go to the atrium, but let's have a break.